Welcome back to pixelprojectradio. Today I thought I'd put out a different sort of episode. Like many of us, the end of a calendar year tends to find me in a reflective state of mind. Doubly so for me, since my birthday also falls on one of the last days of the year. Getting another year older, you know? The vanishing point of 1 year of life into the next is a great time to look back on where we've been as we look to where we're hoping to go. What's shaped us before can help guide and inform us moving forward. While I find myself thinking this way more and more as December winds down, I've also been thinking about this show. How thankful I am to have the opportunity to make this, and how appreciative I am of all of the listeners, both new and old. Pixel Project Radio has seen a lot of positive growth in 2024, and part of this is, I think, because I began to gradually change things over time to be more personal to myself. Namely, talking about games in the way that I talk and think about games, irrespective of microphones and expectations of what a quote-unquote video game podcast is. So, keeping with this idea, today is a more personal episode. Though it's still lighthearted, I'm going to try to keep this to roughly an hour, maybe less if I can help it. I'm going to talk about 10 games that I loved as a kid. 10 games that molded my brain into loving video games, 10 games that really stuck out and left an impression on me. I'll talk about some other games too here and there, but mainly these 10. Some have longer entries than others, so it goes. Again, I didn't want to make this episode too long, and some of these sort of begin and end with, it was fun at the time. But others are more meaningful, and I'll get into that when we get there. So, with that, let's look back, all the way back, at 10 games that shaped me in my formative years. Growing up, I never had a proper Nintendo console. The first Nintendo console I owned was a GameCube. But like many my age, Nintendo's portable offerings found their way into my hands first. Or, for me, my pocket. I logged some serious hours onto my Game Boy Pocket, that lush forest green variant, and was introduced to some classics early on. Tetris was, of course, a standard. Turok and Contra, though not the easiest for me to play, offered some excitement from time to time. And of course, a particularly ubiquitous title that we'll get to in a minute. But one of the first ever cartridges that I played through top to bottom was Super Mario Land 3. Wario Land. Believe it or not, this was my introduction to the Mario series. What with not having an NES or an SNES, you remember? And despite it being looked at as little more than a fine stepping stone into Wario's eventual outgrowth, I loved Wario Land. One of the first things to hook me as a kid was the music. I didn't have the vocabulary to say this back then, but the discordant, semi-churlish, almost smart-alecky music that popped out of that tiny front-facing speaker delighted me to no end. It's a big part of what made me want to pick up the game. And I think Wario Land's markedly slower pace contributed to my success with it as well. I was just a child, and I hadn't cut my teeth on a quote-unquote real Mario game yet. So being able to explore somewhat leisurely for coins and secrets while delighting in the music and goofy monster designs, of course I loved it. But Wario Land also offered me the opportunity to think about physics in video games. How much of a running start did I need to make this gap? What sort of parabolic shape would I soar in if I tried jumping to get these few coins? In other words, it helped onboard me into critical skills of being successful in more complex games that released at a later time, games that I would come to love. And don't get me wrong, I don't mean to spend all the time on Super Mario Land 3. I liked 1 and 2 a lot as well, 2 especially. There's something about 1 and the way the Koopas looked creeped me out back then. But Wario Land was special to me. It helped hook me on the Game Boy, and ultimately guided me by the hand into this next game, though it hardly needed to. By the way, this will be one of the briefer entries on the list. If you want to hear more about the Super Mario Land series, check out episode 104 of the show, where we do a complete retrospective on each of the trilogy. Growing up, I absolutely loved getting gaming magazines from the local county market on shopping trips with my family. Tips and Tricks, PlayStation Underground, the Sonic comics when they were available. I loved them all. As often as they were bought, though, my family never let me subscribe to these magazines. It was a waste of money, they'd say, and there's no reason why those companies should need our address. Color me surprised, then, when a VHS tape appears at our house one afternoon. A VHS of an upcoming new show. A boy in what looked like a jean jacket, a pretty red-headed lady, another fellow who seemingly kept his eyes closed, and some sort of yellow rat. It was the promotional Pokemon VHS tape. To this day, I have no idea how this arrived at our home. Perhaps it was a single mail-away thing, perhaps I'm misremembering my childhood entirely. What I know for certain, though, is that I watched this VHS several times over, alone and with my cousins and friends, and within 2 months, Pokemon fever was everywhere. I've said it before, but it's really difficult to put the ubiquitous and infectious spread of Pokemon into perspective for younger folks of today. Neither the internet nor cell phones existed in the state that they do now, and children certainly didn't have unfettered access to networks of information and constant connection and communication. But nevertheless, Pokemon grew, and grew, and grew. Shortly after the VHS, it was the anime, and shortly thereafter, Pokemon Blue for the Game Boy. And Pokemon Silver for the Game Boy Color. I'm cheating a little by combining the two. They played a massive, massive role in my childhood. They were technically my first JRPGs, instilling a lifelong love of turn-based combat into me, teaching me strategy in the face of random battles and team composition, introducing the importance of speaking to NPCs for quest advice, flavor text, and even jokes. Pokemon was foundational. I played it alongside my 2 older cousins, and the 3 of us formed a sort of nation unto ourselves. We each shared the 3 starters, we each shared the 3 evolutions, we each shared the 3 legendary birds. And this trend continued on into Pokemon Silver as well. The 3 of us playing together every chance we'd get at school, at family gatherings, practically every day of summer vacation. We set out to conquer these games, our nation of 3. And we did. And it wasn't just us. Everyone at school did this very same thing. The period in the mornings at our elementary school between off-boarding buses and the bell ringing to signal the start of morning homeroom saw children gather in our gymnasium, a period of vibrating energy, children, before the school day began, ensuring that everyone stayed in one place until it was time to begin. And every morning in the gym, without fail, Game Boys were out in spades. If you were to turn off the lights, it would have become a chorus of AA battery-powered fireflies, I'm sure, with the LED indicator indicating all of the life that was within. Everyone, I mean everyone, loved Pokemon. And with it came a sort of community that transcended any notion of newly forming cliques or who's popular, who's not. Well, it couldn't entirely transcend these. Children will be children until the end of time. Clearing the gyms, clearing the Elite Four, catching rare Pokemon, being the kid with every starter. We wore these badges with honor. They were status symbols. Not only was this an addictive, fun game, but it built a sort of community too. I won't continue to belabor this point. If you want to hear more of this conversation, not to shill another episode, but check out our episode numbered 123, Why Do We Play Video Games?, where Pokemon gets its own subsection of the discussion. I'm sure Pokemon will appear on the show in some capacity in the future, but until then, I must thank it for shaping my tastes and for enhancing familial and platonic friendships alike. And so begins the era of Sega Saturn. The Game Boy, even now, is a comfort to me. Fighting for light on the screen with passing streetlights on the way home from a family holiday, sneaking in an extra 15 minutes after bedtime, playing with friends at school. In some ways, it defined a generation. My generation. With each console in this episode, I'll also briefly call out some other titles not talked about. Link's Awakening provided laughs with stealing from the item shop while never being easy enough for me to progress in. Kirby's Dream Land 2 fascinated me with the abilities and the animals at your disposal, not to mention the hamster that shared my name. Game & Watch Gallery let me enjoy the arcade experience. Donkey Kong 92, now my all-time favorite Game Boy game, let me explore movement and mild puzzle solving in getting from point A to point B. But home consoles were on my horizon. It's no secret that the PlayStation 1 was a big part of my childhood. I've said as much many times before, and I'm hardly alone in that. It was a really special console. But before I was given one by my family, there was another. A console that is terribly overlooked, that will always hold an extremely special place in my heart. The Sega Saturn. The Saturn was my first ever home console, and I was ushered in with none other than this famous title, belted by Takenobu Mitsuyoshi. Daytona USA and Need for Speed were among the earliest titles that I played, complete with the Saturn racing wheel. Dark-like Conflict took me from paved speedways to intergalactic travel in... well, I don't actually remember the point of that game at all. From space to mechs, Mech Warrior, although too complicated for me to figure out at the time, let me attempt to blast enemies to smithereens. Sonic 3D Blast, my first real introduction to Sonic, yeah that's right, let me gather the flickies and made every other game's visual presentation feel pallid by comparison. But there were 3 Saturn games that earned my time more than the others. Let's take a look at a few of my then favorites for Sega's underappreciated console. The memory of how I came across owning Scud is yet again lost to time. If I dwell on these holes in my memory, I might have some sort of breakdown. Anyway, Scud was one of the first Saturn games I ever owned, and, well, I never could get very far. I couldn't remember why until I played the game earlier last year in 2023. Then I remembered, it's just not a very good game. Scud, the Disposable Assassin, is a video game adaptation of a gritty, of the 90s comic book of the same name. From the minds of Rob Schrab and Dan Harmon, yeah, seriously, there's a Scud reference in Community even. Scud told the story of a future where you could buy a disposable assassin from a vending machine. Once they hit their mark, curtains. They self-destruct. Our titular character targets a creature known as Jeff that I'm not really certain I could aptly describe in audio form, but driven by self-preservation, Scud decides that he doesn't want to die. He wounds Jeff, and the comics see him working as a freelance assassin to pay off Jeff's medical bills. I'm assuming he can take out others that aren't his assigned target without self-destructing? I don't know, I haven't read the comics. Scud the game takes this premise largely with Jeff being the first boss. And he does in fact get away. The gameplay of Scud is strange. It's a 2D side-scroller where your objective is to get to the end of the level. Most levels, though, aren't a straight line like one might expect from, say, Cuphead or Streets of Rage or the yet-to-be-discussed Clockwork Knight. These levels often had you going left and right, and exploring verticality, too. Because of this, combined with the questionable layout, I'm specifically thinking of the opening vault-esque areas in the later city area, as well as the genuinely poor enemy placement, this game has a bit too much guesswork for me. You're always a hair away from being ambushed and crumpled like the tin can you ultimately are. And that's a fair point too. Scud isn't exactly a tank. You're gonna take a lot of damage. You're going to die. It's just how it goes. And the game doesn't feature a save system. It's arcade-inspired in that way. So a full game over means fully restarting. This and the fragility alone would be fine, but together they synthesize a real annoyance, a real pain in the ass. And speaking of arcade-inspired, there are light gun sections too, although largely, or maybe even only in the first level. This takes you down one single corridor in a first-person point of view as Scud shooting these rabid dogs that attack you. I'm not sure how this was supposed to control with a controller-light gun combination, or if it even could now that I think of it. But on the controller alone, it just wasn't great. It wasn't overly difficult, it just felt mashy and tedious and like filler to draw in a crowd to say, check out the different styles we're trying. That's all well and good, but if you're going to diversify gameplay, you have to do something more than have it exist just for the sake of it. So Scud was, overall, not great, but I loved it all the same. The grungy, noir-tinged soundtrack, that 90s grit I had mentioned, even the cover and back panel art of the case, I loved it. But ultimately, I would move on to other Saturn games. Clockwork Knight, a game that I didn't know that anyone else knew about until damn near my 30s. This game felt tailor-made for young kids. It was bright, there isn't any real violence, the entire setting involves toys inside of a regular house, and just listen to this music. Clockwork Knight has you playing as young Pepperidge Chow, a knight clad in yellow and a dandy mustache off to save the princess for whom he pines in hopes of getting to her before his rival. It's pretty standard gameplay-wise. A 2D side-scroller where you platform across the levels and beat some enemies throughout. The platforming physics feel surprisingly decent, until you get to the kitchen level, which is influenced by the ice capades more than any platforming game or segment ever should be. Taking out the enemies feels fine enough. Pepperidge Chow fights with a key, which I think probably makes this some sort of Kingdom Hearts spin-off, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. You heard it here first, and I expect to be compensated. But anyway, once Pepperidge Chow plants his key in an enemy, he can turn it a few times to inflate and then pop them like a balloon. And of course, the music. While I don't have as much to say about Clockwork Knight as, say, Pokemon or some of the upcoming games, it still firmly has a place in my heart. It's good, clean fun. It can be beaten within one play session, and if you're a Saturn enjoyer like I am, I encourage you to check it out. But Clockwork Knight would quickly be overtaken. My love for fighting games began early, and it began on the Saturn. But I didn't pay my dues on 2D fighters like Street Fighter. I did have a copy of Street Fighter Alpha, Warrior's Dream, and I'd eventually log some real hours into EX2+. But what I really loved was the early 3D fighters. 3 in particular kept me coming back. Virtua Fighter 2, Fighters Megamix, and Battle Arena Toshinden Remix. I absolutely adore each of these games, and Fighters Megamix is one of my all-time favorite fighters. It takes its engine from both Virtua Fighter 2 and 3 and Fighting Vipers. Players can toggle between the two, along with characters from each series, and is stylish and surprisingly complex. It's the best game of the 3 here, no contest, and as of now, in my personal pantheon of fighting games. But it was Battle Arena Toshinden that hooked my friends and I, refusing to let go. Let's get this out of the way. Toshinden isn't exactly a series known for having fantastic quality. The movements are awkward and the physics feel sluggish, the balance is questionable, and the voice acting is, well...
You are dressed like a knight! Is this a tournament or a costume party?
You mock me?
A joke, good knight. That's all. One last laugh before you die.
You get the idea. Not to mention that, in my opinion anyway, the trilogy that we got here in the States got worse with each iteration. None of that mattered to me though. I played Remix constantly. Having characters speak in games was enough for me back then, and as a youngster who button mashed, I don't think I really thought much about balance or movement. What did I think about? The characters, man, the characters. Even now, I love the character design in Remix. Eiji and Kaien were the definition of cool, young swordsmen with attitude that blended traditional clothing from the East with 90s fashion. Ellis was adorable, a fairy dance troupe-esque fighter with bright green hair and dirks, a Psy-like weapon that reminded me of my favorite Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, Raphael, and my favorite character, Fo Fai, an old, high-pitched Chinese man who feigns politeness to mask his true, sadistic, murderous intent. He creeped me out a lot as a kid. The characters felt alive to me. inviting me into their universe in the same way Saturday morning cartoons did, yet other video games of the time failed to accomplish. Not for a lack of trying, of course, but Clockwork Knight and Daytona USA could only do so much. And I couldn't articulate this at the time, of course, but having polygons be texture wrapped as opposed to flat shading like in Virtua Fighter gave it a presentation that, especially back then, looked simply fantastic. Believe it or not, there was a brief window when this series was it, man. A short period of time when Toshinden was king. The gameplay was similar to Fighter's Mega Mix while still having some elements of Street Fighter 2. Ring-outs were a way one could win matches, and given the insane gravity, it felt like 75% or something, how high you could jump, and move commitment approaching Dark Souls levels, ring-outs were fairly common. The sidestepping element introduced in Virtua Fighter 3 and Mega Mix was here. It was less of a sidestep and more of an elaborate pirouette or theater roll. Shoulder buttons on the Saturn controller felt great, or at least they did on the second-gen controller, the version 2. The Street Fighter elements I mentioned earlier were largely boiled down to special moves and inputs. Fireballs could be done with a quarter circle, Dragon Punch-esque weapon moves could be done with the Z motion, or 623 motion, depending on your nomenclature, and specials could be powered up as well. This and Street Fighter Alpha and EX2 Plus on the PS1 were where I learned my fighting game movements and my affinity for a D-pad, and they've stuck with me even to this day, even as I've transitioned to a leverless controller. Going through the story mode was incredible for me, and to this day is still my favorite part of playing fighting games. It's true, I like playing with friends, but I'm not someone that plays all that often online. I loved playing through each round, fighting combatant after combatant, imagining an elaborate storyline of deception, revenge, and challenge in my mind. Toshinden took it a step further with precursory asides, giving a brief, if not hurried, setup for why these fighters were facing each other. Sometimes it was just because a tournament is a tournament is a tournament, sometimes it fed into the lore. And sometimes it was faux fi, just embracing the identity of a murderous old man. And getting to the end, finding the secret bosses of Gaia, Sho, and Cupido, who weren't normally playable characters but only teased in the cutscenes? I was an excavator, and they were my treasure. I had struck gold in finding them. A side note here, those boss fights are bullshit. Balance just wasn't thought about here, and the bosses and enemy inputs were just not going to be beaten without some level of cheese in a game this clunky. Gaia in a gigantic elaborate costume moves faster than an actual theater-trained dancer. Get real. Of course, time ceaselessly moves forward. It's one of life's only truths. I kept and played my Saturn even well into middle school when the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube arrived onto the scene. I treasured that thing, but the allure of the then upcoming PlayStation 1 was too much to ignore, and when I got one for Christmas, it was love at first sight. My time with the original PlayStation was, in a word, fantastic. Animorphs let me take the role of my then favorite book series. Cool Borders 2 and Tony Hawk challenged me to land complex moves with not so complex inputs. Digimon World 1 and 2, different as they were, cemented my love for the Digimon series over Pokemon, even if the games weren't as good. Crash Team Racing, Blast Chamber, Brave Fencer Musashi, The Legend of Dragoon, there are so many games I could list. The PS1 is one of history's most special consoles. But, as before, there are a handful of games that kept me around longer than most, beginning with one that I love to this day and that I played as recently as last year in 2023. And wouldn't you know it, it just got a re-release. Or at least the first entry in the series did. But no, my love was for the sequel. My love was for Tomba 2. I'll be honest, I can't for the life of me remember how this came into my hands. I mean, I had never heard of Tomba 1, much less played it, but from the minute I popped in this disc, I was absolutely hooked. Like Legend of Dragoon, it immediately surprised me with early voice acting. The narrator, the characters, they were talking to me. I didn't have to imagine what Zippo sounded like when speaking, or what Tomba sounded like when jumping off a high ledge, or what the old man with the house on fire sounded like telling me that his house was on fire, with all the enthusiasm of a third grader popcorn reading in front of their peers. It was all right there. And much like Wario Land, only to a significantly greater degree, I knew even back then that the soundtrack was primo. I loved the theme to the Fisherman's Village back then, and I love it now, maybe even more so. And that's not even to speak on some of the amazing tracks that come later on. Tomba is what we might call a 2.5 platformer today, 2.5D. The gameplay is mostly 2D at heart, running left to right, but at different times, Tomba will be prompted to turn, or take a different path that goes off the x-axis and onto the y, or on some diagonal path. Really should have stuck with compass nomenclature. Anyway, I delighted in taking out the evil swine, the winged group of angry little piggies that had overrun Tomba's otherwise peaceful land. I never did back then know exactly what the point of the game was, outside of trying to find your childhood friend, girlfriend, tabby, but it didn't matter. I loved running around, talking to the NPCs, gaining side quests that I had no idea what to do with, and dying more times than I could probably count. At various points in the game, Tomba will acquire clothing upgrades that impact his movement. Not in a negative way, like new jeans after Thanksgiving. I've made this joke on the show before, son of a bitch. But pants that might let him run faster, or a vest that might let him float gently down through the air rather than fall like a regular jungle boy. I ended up getting much farther into the endgame as an adult, but I don't think I ever found myself there as a kid. All the better. I'm not sure I would have really known what to do in some of the later levels. Tomba doesn't just acquire clothing, though. He also acquires new weapons. Boomerangs, ice boomerangs, a chain whip thing, and he must use all of these to his advantage to take down various enemy types. The second town you move into, for example, is full of fire monsters. They look sort of like jellied blobs that perpetually burn and have a particularly bad attitude toward little jungle boys. Normal weapons do nothing, and biting them isn't much more effective, as you can imagine, but the ice boomerang, oh, now that allows Tomba to freeze him solid, giving him ample opportunity to hop on top and do his patented grab and flip, tossing them right into a wall or, my favorite, another enemy, and clearing the way. I don't believe as a kid I ever did make it past the third town or so, a town full of ice in which you need the insulated squirrel suit. My childhood friend and previous guest on the show, Dustin, has an older sister who got much farther than me in the game, but as dictated by elementary schooler rules, talking to kids, much less girls, more than a couple of grades above you was simply not gonna fly. But so while my progress was hampered, I didn't mind. I was happy to boot up Tomba 2 and start all over again, and over again, and over again, going through another loop, through the town of the fishermen, through the mining area, and eventually going back to do it all over again. It's funny how time doesn't spend as preciously when we're children. It's not that we have more of it, but it's not a protected commodity. It isn't our most valuable resource. We were content to use it freely. There really is much to learn from our collective past. One part of using time freely is spending it learning how to play a game. And once again, back to fighting games that involved learning moves. And not just combos, but special moves. And not just special moves, but fatalities. And with the introduction of the first 3D Mortal Kombat game onto the PS1, that's exactly what I did. Mortal Kombat. They can't all be winners. But that's the beauty of childhood innocence. A game lives and dies by how entertaining it is, quality be damned. Mortal Kombat 4 is an interesting title in the series. It was the first ever jump into the 3D space, no doubt cashing in on the success of Tekken's 1 through 3 and Street Fighter EX. Their development staff had increased, and they decided that they wanted to make a darker, more intense game. They removed some of the comical elements, like animalities and babalities, and put the focus on developing gruesome fatalities. To their credit, A+ for the time. It was wicked stuff. But removed comedic content? Well, characters sound like this, first of all.
Oh, I gotta throw you over there!
Yeah, during throws, some characters would yell out, "Oh, I'm gonna throw you over there." And we cannot forget Jax's story ending, the climactic showdown against Kano.
Going somewhere, Jarek?
Jax! I thought you were going to...
Thought I was what? Dead? Like my partner you just tossed off the cliff?
I'm sorry, Jax. Please, don't drop me. Wait, I promise.
Too late, Jarek.
You can't drop me. You have to uphold the law. You have to arrest me. Wait, this is brutality. You can't do it.
Wrong, Jarek. This is not a brutality. This is a fatality.
Jank aside, and I mean all of it, Mortal Kombat 4 brought Mortal Kombat into the evolving console scene. Characters were talking, screaming in agony, shouting in vengeance-driven violence. In a word, it was awesome. I played the arcade mode to death, unlocking every single enemy and learning every single fatality that the game had to offer. As far as gameplay went, it was, it was pretty rough. I don't really feel like Mortal Kombat did 3D fighters all too well, and seeing it fade away by 9 was a welcome change. It wasn't all bad, though. Mortal Kombat's foray into 3D brought us Shaolin Monks, which to this day is a fan favorite, with many hoping for its eventual remake. And the 3D fighting was admittedly polished up in the PS2 titles. Once they returned to the 2D plane in Mortal Kombat 2011, though, that's when they really hit their stride, if you ask me. That game, 2011, up through Mortal Kombat 1, which just came out recently, though all of those games are not on equal footing, it's a total hot streak, the series returning to its former glory after a sort of soggy middle period. Will Mortal Kombat 4 be remembered? Well, maybe not for the reasons that the team had hoped. If you ask me, the greatest sin the team committed was putting Mortal Kombat 4 Gold, the best version of the game, onto the Dreamcast. I have nothing against the Dreamcast, really. Not that it would have heard me saying that over the insane disk drive noise that it had, but those controllers are some of the worst in mainline consoles. I'll stick by that take, too. So let's move from one fighting game to another. Or at least, some might call this a fighting game. That's a conversation for another day. Something I've talked about on the show before is the reason behind playing video games. Why play them now as adults, sure, but why we play them as children too. Escapism, imagination, power fantasies, it's all a core part of children being at play. I have so many visceral memories of being with my childhood best friend and our neighbors entertaining ourselves entirely in imaginary worlds, mainly through playing with action figures, toys, aka, and pretend, which of course we'd never call it that. Want to play the game we always play is what we said, that's how we said it. This was, of course, followed by a barrage of pretend you saw this and pretend that missed me, and so on. We didn't think it through. One of the aspects of playing with toys or playing pretend we liked so much was that nothing was off limits. It was entirely interdisciplinary, entirely brand and console and TV channel free. Things could be mixed. It's no surprise then that Super Smash Bros. Was such a fantastic hit among, well, everybody. I can't speak for older kids at the time, but all my friends could talk about when Smash 64 dropped was how freaking cool it was to put Pikachu versus Mario, or Link versus Donkey Kong, and who was Ness anyway? Doesn't matter, none of us could unlock him. But as much as I loved Smash, it wasn't until Melee that I was absolutely hooked. This was one of 2 games I got for Christmas along with a GameCube one year. The other game being World Tour, a scooter game that got very mixed reviews. I don't think I played it more than 2 hours. And once I picked it up, Smash Melee that is, I didn't want to put it down. The intro cinematic was gritty. This wasn't painted so much as a fun romp with figures from a toy chest, a video game version of playing pretend with toys that my friends and I played like what was depicted in 64. This was depicted in stunning new graphics as a battle. This was epic. It's no wonder that my cohort glommed onto it so hard. The game was maturing along with us. We were entering our preteen and earliest teen years. We were growing up and were confused and weren't sure what was cool or in anymore. Melee coming along helped shepherd us forward in a way, a hand on the shoulder, telling us that this was still cool, and look how cool, look how new, look how much more serious this was. For older kids, this was. And though the new sheen of maturity began at the graphics, it didn't end there. The game, compared to 64, was massive. The roster had just more than doubled, and the new characters were so exciting. Mewtwo and Pichu, newcomers Marth and Roy that at that time were like, oh my god, sword fighters. What a time. Bowser, Zelda, Ganon, there were so many new moves to discover, not to mention the addition of the forward special that wasn't present in Smash 64. It wasn't just the look of the intro cinematic that evolved. The strategy did too. But I must confess, okay, I can't speak too much onto the strategy of the game if I'm strictly going off of my memories. I went through several phases as an adult practicing to get good at Smash, and I think that I am, and because of this I'm well aware of the meta. But back then, no, it was all smash attacks all the time. Specials like crazy, items on all the time, spamming counter and forward smash with Roy to say, oh yeah, I could beat 3 level 9 CPUs easy. I figured that in the spirit of veracity and honesty, I should put that out here now. Parties, sleepovers, solo play, crafting elaborate stories in my head, working with friends to complete all the event challenges. Melee was special. Melee brought us together in the way that only Smash could. Casuals and sweats alike, beating the snot out of each other and having a grand time doing it. Given how hard he's worked over the years, Sakurai deserves a rest. One of life's cruelest jokes is aging. I know, it's an incredibly banal and trite platitude, but how true it continually proves to be. Something that I grapple with now is that of memory. Each time I recall a memory, it feels infinitesimally more artificial, just a skosh more constructed than it was before, a bit more faded, like looking through a fogged window. This is a real phenomenon, by the way, the reconstruction of memories. But what I mean to get at here is this. I have lost some of the particulars of my childhood, but the impactful moments, the things that shaped me, they remain. And as far as video games go, Kingdom Hearts not only rocked my world, but it rocked my friends' worlds too, and brought us closer together in the process. There are many things about Kingdom Hearts that are wonderful, but combining JRPG design, story, and intrigue with Disney characters and worlds that are largely very true to themselves is at the top. This seemed like a game tailor-made for kids our age, preteens to early teens. I don't mean that in a pejorative or derogatory way either. I mean it in the same manner a Disney film may be. Something that can reinforce values of goodness and wellness that confronts the darkness, okay, I know, before real life batters one down with it. Kingdom Hearts was that in game form. My childhood best friend and I, though me more than him, loved Final Fantasy, and we liked Disney okay too. We weren't yet in the hollowed out valley of turning our noses up at Disney, kids stuff, saccharine and moral-laden wastes of time. But Disney and Final Fantasy together, we were hooked almost immediately, and unknowingly playing our first action RPG. The combat in Kingdom Hearts 1 is, especially compared to the rest of the series, very simple. Perfect for children who weren't interested in thinking of strategy as much as bashing Heartless. The strategy did come though. It almost has to after you play the game tip to toe 3 or 4 times like I did. And just like with Pokemon before it, the playground rumor mill was rife with tips, tricks, and secrets, some true and some fibs, on secret bosses and areas and endings. Beating the game's 4 secret bosses was a milestone of which I was, and remain, very proud. Sephiroth challenged me to stop smashing and think about how to win. A much more difficult fight than his debut in Final Fantasy VII, if you ask me. But still, Sephiroth all the same, in his glory. I must have loaded up that save dozens of times just to hear the One-Winged Angel arrangement playing as you fought him in the Colosseum. In retrospect, Kingdom Hearts serves as a crucially important declaration of tone in media. Sincerity is a virtue. I'm hardly the first to speak about this, but irony, the inability to dwell and sit in the sincere, has invaded media like a fungus. As much as I love The Simpsons and find that show to be a paramount of creativity and writing in adult animation, this can be traced in part to there. Irony, self-awareness, and cynicism was elevated and highlighted, carried like a badge of honor in future shows like South Park, Family Guy, and Rick and Morty, and has been oft observed in the plague that is Whedonification of movie dialogue. Look at any Marvel movie. Each example makes one thing clear. Sincerity is out. It's hip to be ironic, to be self-sabotaging, to force a quip into an otherwise touching moment. First of all, I won't sit here and pretend that I don't enjoy some of those examples. While I personally can't stand Marvel movies and have never really watched Rick and Morty, each of these others cited, and more, have long been in my rotation, and still sometimes are. My intention is not to convince anybody that I'm the guru on the mount, the enlightened one that sees beyond all this bullshit, but I will say this. The older I get, the more I gravitate towards sincerity. I have less and less desire to be in on the joke with the writers of the show, feeling the feeling of moral grandstanding, and we know you're not like all those other viewers watching all those other shows. We aren't either. It's become blasé, it's become uninteresting. It teeters on lazy and obsequious, looks to kiss the asses of the viewers who want to be made to feel special and above it all. The antidote to this is sincerity. And to refocus this back to games without further losing the thread, Kingdom Hearts remains an ever-present example of this. And by the way, anybody that knows anything about the new sincerity movement, largely but not entirely founded by my favorite writer David Foster Wallace, will know that I am not the first in any way to speak about this. I would like to do an essay on this sometime for the show. We'll see what happens. It would be foolish and abjectly wrong to claim that Kingdom Hearts has been immune to humor. Of course not, it's been there from the start. But it doesn't aim to dull its messaging with misplaced quips or winks and nods at the audience after the, "You know guys, I learned something today" monologue. On the contrary, it lays a hand or two on the shoulders of the player and says, listen, friendship is critically important. Friendship is one of the best feelings in life. Friendship is what it means to be human. And it does so unabashedly, without any shame, without any hesitation. Kingdom Hearts is light, Sora says, and I've got my friends behind me to champion it. This is, of course, an important precedent to set, that sincerity is just and good. And I'm thankful that I played Kingdom Hearts when I did, around 4th grade, and of course replays throughout middle and high school too, just before and while I was entering into the period during which irony and nomadism and counterculture became, ironically, the popular things to embrace. Kingdom Hearts stood as one of a few examples that stood firm, that sincerity is beautiful, is virtuous. This is also something that I couldn't articulate at the time, but the feeling always remained with me whenever I would boot up the game in middle school, in high school, in college, and beyond. Something about this game is good. The core of this game is good. It is goodness personified and represented. I don't know. Perhaps much like Kurt Vonnegut by his own admission, I'm getting more sentimental as I age. I stand by it though. Kingdom Hearts is far from the only example of unbridled optimism of the human soul, of not depicting the horrors of the world but of the ideal. Together, we must take a step backward though, to close this episode out, and to talk about the most important game of my childhood. Of course, I speak of Final Fantasy IX. Longtime listeners of the show knew this was coming. This December of 2024, if you're listening in the future, this December I wanted to do a handful of episodes that, from a pragmatic point of view, were a little lighter in terms of analysis. A little bit of a brain break, something more digestible and approachable. And pragmatically, it frees me up at the end of the year. I'm human too. I also wanted to start doing more personal episodes, talking about my memories with gaming, things that shaped me, the feelings I had and the ones I still have. I'm almost certainly going to release another Top 10 episode where I talk about the games that shape me now as a 30-something-year-old, but reflecting on how my tastes were formed and what I loved as a kid has been really rewarding. Perhaps it's getting older, or perhaps it's the desire to look for ever-increasing complexity and depth in the games we consume. And not just games, but movies and literature too, at least for me. But sometimes I feel that we lose the childhood spark, the innocence of play that is us just enjoying things for being entertaining on their face. I'm hardly saying anything new here. The notion of rediscovering childlike wonder is something that authors and philosophers and teachers and many other folks in many other occupations have all said before me. Even still, it's valuable to think about. Classical and orchestral musicians talk about this all the time. The late John Delancey, well-known oboist and principal of the Philadelphia Orchestra, once quipped, and I'm paraphrasing here, that music wasn't always, and maybe even hardly ever was fun, that it was a job, which isn't to say that it's not enjoyable, but it was hard work. The enjoyment came from the work, and sometimes, sure, it could be fun, but fun was not the point. It was work. Rewarding work. Now, of course, this isn't a one-to-one reflection. Most of us aren't making a living playing video games or reading books or making podcasts, so the exchange rate isn't equivalent. But I can speak for myself and say that as I engage with media and try to absorb and learn as much as I can from it, I find myself losing that childlike spark, that desire to just have fun. It can be anything. A work by my favorite author like David Foster Wallace or Sylvia Plath, a film by Miyazaki, a composition by Viet Quang, or a game by any number of developers. Engaging critically, mining as many precious jewels as one can from these works takes, well, work. To echo Delancey, it's not that it isn't enjoyable, it almost always is, but, and here's where I'm veering from his sentiment, it can get in the way of having fun. Of course, I'm not suggesting that fun, as arbitrary and opaque of a metric as that is, should be an attribute toward which all video games should strive. Far from it. There is value to be had in changing and challenging the balance between fun and enjoyment, or fun and any other meaningful adjective. The problems arise, I feel, when we lose sight of the meaningful distinction and lose the ability to toggle it for ourselves, when we attempt to look at all works through the same lens, when we try to fit square pegs into round holes, when we observe the painting too close to the canvas. Whatever metaphor you'd like to use, really. Again, what is fun for me will likely not transfer to all of you in equivalent exchange. The same can be said with enjoyable or rewarding. Due to this becomes sort of a sliding scale where we all need to find our own balance of critical eye and entertainment. We need to let the water teach us to swim. But allowing oneself to feel the innocence of enjoyment, never losing sight of what it felt like the first time one picked up a controller, this must never be lost. This is important. This must never be forgotten. Final Fantasy IX is the game that brings me back. It's the game that grounds me. It is my reference point. My friends know this, longtime listeners know this, and if you don't know this yourself, I invite you to take a listen to our 5-part series from early 2024. I am exceptionally proud of how that turned out. Final Fantasy IX, thematically appropriate as this is, represents a purity of soul to me, a work that will without fail allow me to be as a child is when enjoying it. It also turns out that I learned something new from it with each playthrough. It's why it will always be the most important game in my history of the medium. I hope you can find your own Final Fantasy IX too, in every medium you enjoy. We are each the sum of the company we keep. Be that company books, games, ideas, people, or pets, we are shaped by those with whom and that with which we engage. This was a sampling of my company. As it turns out, we are also each a bit too complex to capture in a short-form audio presentation. Who would have thought? Perhaps another day I'll take another look back at some of the other companies I've kept over time. Perhaps I'll take a look at some that I keep now. And I do hope you'll join me when that time comes. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear your story too. Let's continue this conversation in the pixelprojectradio Discord server. The link's in the description. I hope I've given you something to think about today, and I hope to talk to you real soon.